How's it going, everybody? Welcome, welcome. We have a pretty full call today, so we're going to give people about a minute here, a minute and a half, just to get in and get settled. In the meantime, if you want to drop in the chat where you're from, what your target score is for the LSAT, just a good way to kickstart some conversation. Sounds very muffled. Got Billy in the chat, nice. Awesome, seeing some 170s. Yeah, and Priscilla, I see your message that I'm muffled. I'll try and speak up. Let me know if you still can't hear me, and I'll try and articulate as best as I can. Nice. Awesome. I'm glad that everybody is shooting high. So for those who just joined, we're giving people about 30 more seconds to join into the chat or join the call. Feel free to post in the chat where you're from, what your target score is for the LSAT. I've heard through the grapevine that that's been a big question for a lot of folks throughout this LSAT Bootcamp week. So yeah, happy to dig in, and we're definitely going to get after it today. Nice. Okay, everyone. Well, without further ado, we're going to get started. So welcome. My name is Zach. I will be your LSAT coach for today. I've been with Leland, and this is my second event with them. So the very first event I did was mainly focused on logical reasoning. Today, all about reading comprehension. We're going to dig right in, make sure that you are prepped and set for success, and that hopefully you walk away with a little bit of a different understanding of reading comprehension, or at least one that works for you. So got the upcoming LSAT Bootcamp. Feel free to check that out, but we're going to dive in. So once again, my name's Zach. I have been tutoring the LSAT for about 2 years now. I am based in Denver, Colorado. And yeah, I've been doing this for about 2 years. I really enjoy it. I'm actually in my last 2 weeks of law school right now. So it is possible you will get there. It's a really long road, but really happy just to be here and share a little bit about what I know. And of course, there's, an Ask Us Anything after this event, but we're going to get right to it. Here's me again. Here's a quick little review. People like me, so maybe you'll like me too. So just a little roadmap of what we're going to be doing today. What is reading comprehension? It seems like, as many things are in the LSAT, this very basic word that is actually loaded with meaning. And we're going to dig into what the LSAT test makers expected you to know about reading comprehension before you go into this test. And of course, we're going to discuss how to improve. And then we're going to have a little bit of time for a 5-minute Q&A. So follow along. If you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We will, however, have a couple breaks interspersed throughout where I'll take the time to read the chat, get back to people and any burning questions before that Q&A. So just a quick survey. Everyone has totally unique and different challenges with the LSAT. If anyone just wants to post in the chat, what has been the most difficult part of studying for the LSAT for you? Feel free to share. Endurance, for sure. Time was a classic and definitely bites you most on reading comprehension. Barely even starting while you're here today, so hopefully that takes it a little bit further. Neurodivergence is a huge one. I worked with several people with several different neurodivergent conditions, and the LSAT is really challenging in that way. So if you have not thought about seeking accommodations, I would heavily consider doing so. They can be very helpful for neurodivergent test takers. Yeah, bad test days suck, or even just having a bad day when you're trying to study for the LSAT. tired, hungry. So yeah, kind of exactly what, is to be expected. Score plateaus, difficulty focusing, exhaustion. Sometimes it can be kind of isolating. Lack of support is huge. Knowing when to test is really important as well. And of course, some of you are working adults, some of you are busy undergrads. Lack of study time can be deeply upsetting. And then feeling confused. This is a really complicated test, unlike anything that you've done before. So a lot of these concepts are going to be new. A lot of things are going to be hitting you head on. And that is why it's so important to get a head start in a program like this. So the number one mistake that students make on reading comprehension is not knowing how to read with purpose. We are conditioned in elementary school, middle school, high school to read and skim as quickly as we can to have a basic understanding of the text. The difference here is we need to critically engage with the text. We need to have all of our attention picking apart the smallest details. Why? Why is it written this way? Why did the LSAT test makers want us to read this passage? What are we supposed to take from it? So starting here with the nuts and bolts, hopefully this gives you all a little bit more confidence, a little bit more direction. It could be a starting point for you to start improving your reading comprehension if that is where you started plateauing. It's a great time, pen paper activity. This is a tutoring session, coaching session. So please feel free to follow along. We'll be doing some practice problems at the end, and it might be helpful just to keep notes for yourself. So reading comprehension is often the hardest score to improve. And it's often when students come to me to ask for tutoring, is because they've, done a great job with logical reasoning. Back when logic games were a thing, they had mastered logic games and they were still getting 10, 12, 14 out of 27 on their reading comprehension score. And really at its most base is, if you're plateauing, you need to switch something up. You have to change the formula. And that is really what today is about. It's just giving a new lens for you to try as you're approaching reading comprehension sections. So reading comprehension is really two distinct processes. The first is reading the passage, and the second is answering the questions, right? Two slightly different approaches. Sorry, Savannah, I see that it says that I sound muffled. I'll try and articulate. It seems like most people can hear. It's about 50-50, so apologies for any technical difficulties. But Savannah, feel free to follow along on the screen. A lot of what I say will be written out for those who prefer to read. So reading the passage and answering the questions. Answering the questions is pretty secondary when it comes to improving your score. At this point, if you're practicing logical reasoning, if you've, learned from 7-Sage or Blueprint or another tutoring resource, that is one of the best ways to learn how to answer the questions. Today, though, how to read critically, how to get better at reading. That's what today's about. So follow along and we're going to dig right in. So what does reading comprehension even mean? At its most base, it means to read with understanding. And with that comes a goal. Every LSAT reading passage, no matter what it is going to have some sort of story. It could be the most technical, scientific literature that you've ever read in your life that you have no understanding of. Or it could be about an art dealer doing illegal mafia dealings in 1930s Brooklyn. You have no idea what it's going to be. But what's important to know is that they're telling you a story and they want you to understand why that story is being told. So once again, they're going to have science, humanities, law, or philosophy passages. So here's how to approach reading comprehension. First step is to understand what type of passage am I reading? And typically the way that we start is by looking on this sliding scale. On one hand, we have objective. And what that's going to mean is that this passage is very neutral toned. It's very informative and it presents both sides as equally as it can. On the other hand, you're going to have persuasive passages. It's going to pick a side. It might try and sell you on some sort of belief or concept or theory. And while it will usually address counterpoints, it's often going to skim those counterpoints and then either quickly rebuff them or move on and dismiss them. That being said, nothing is perfectly objective or perfectly persuasive. That is human nature, and that is how we write. But this is important to understanding how we actually get to the questions and like trying to discern the actual meaning of the passage itself. The next part is that we have a story and we have the reading comprehension word search. What makes for a good story? What is most important to conveying your message? Well, the first thing is that you're probably going to have some strong main characters or some motivating force that is carrying the story along. It could be as simple as, King Arthur pulled a sword out of a stone, or it could be Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos and discovered giant tortoises, and it goes into a whole thing of evolution. The point is, there's always going to be someone or something driving the story. Times and dates I put second because, maybe it's just a natural inclination of future law students to be, repellent to numbers in all of their forms and shapes. If the LSAT is ever dropping in times, dates, numbers, there's a reason. It's because we are trying to skim over that information when really those are being plugged in because they might be important. It could be having to do with chronology or some sort of understanding if a molecule is bigger or smaller than its counterpart. So always paying attention to numbers, which typically take place in the form of times and dates. Along those same lines as places and locations, this can be one of those things that trips people up, right? The answer might be perfect, but instead of talking about Papua New Guinea, we're talking about New Zealand, and all of a sudden your answer goes out the window. One of the more tricky things, and something we'll be working on today, are tonal shifts. Perhaps a passage starts as very objective, very informative, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the author gives you a strong belief or asks you to take a position. That tends to be important because that's going to tie into what the main point is of the passage. It's about trying to be persuaded to one side or the other. Next is going to be structure, which plays along with tonal shifts, along with the rest of this. You need to be paying attention to how different paragraphs typically interplay with each other. Many of the question types are asking about the structure of the passage. So that is paying attention to how they interplay with each other. Is one passage a counterpoint to another? Is it directly challenging a notion in a preceding or following paragraph? These things are always critical to pay attention to. And of course, main and minor points, right? Always trying to dissect what the point is of what we're reading. And that kind of gets to the heart of it. Sometimes it'll be really on its face and it's easy to understand why we're being told something, what we're trying to be persuaded of, For instance, everyone should go sign up for a Leland free LSAT course, right? You see that in a passage, you know exactly what you're getting, but it might be different. It might be more nuanced. And then finally, probably the most important is key concepts and themes. A lot of the times in each of these passages, especially science ones, it's going to ask you to understand something, going a little bit deeper than just plucking content out of the passage to answer questions, and more about understanding the processes or the mechanics or the actual timeline of how some sort of key concept, idea, or theme occurs. So I equate this to a word search because this is pretty endless, right? You never quite know what is going to be most important, but these are things to keep in mind. They should jump out at you when they occur, and they should be things that you're actively looking for every time you're reading a different line of the passage, always searching for the next nugget of information. Let's talk a bit about key concepts. Each passage will have some sort of key concepts. Once again, it can be very simple, right? Go sign up for a Leland course. Or alternatively, it can be really complicated. It could be, do you understand Einstein's theory of relativity? It's a big challenge, right? So let's take a look at these two examples. Isaac Newton first described his laws of motion in 1549. I made that up. I don't know when it happened. However, the theory of relativity was not explained until 1912 by Albert Einstein. Clearly, Einstein's genius relies upon the work of previous scientists. Boom, we get our key concept or our key theme. And we kind of get this hint, right? We're going to understand that something happened between 1549 and 1912 that allowed Albert Einstein to come to the conclusion that he needed to. And then next down here, right, we have same idea except for a humanities passage. Shakespeare, the bard of Stratford upon Avon, could not have been born a peasant. Whoa, okay, right? That sticks out. It's a pretty persuasive and strong claim. For his work, A Midsummer Night's Dream understands the aristocracy too well for a peasant. By kind of combining these two separate things here, understanding these two key concepts, we understand what we're about to read, right? We get a whole roadmap for why we're reading this passage and what the LSAT test taker really wants us to take away from this, right? Okay, in this one, probably need to understand, what is happening with the aristocracy? Why couldn't the peasant understand it? And like, how does that relate to the book or the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream? Similarly, does one have to be a genius to rely upon the work of previous scientists? We need to connect the dots. We need more information, and now we know what we're looking for as we continue reading. So just some pretty easy tips. Use your highlighters. You will get 3 different highlighters on the LSAT on your computer screen. Some people are very adverse to it, and I can understand it feeling like time consuming or feeling as if it is a hassle or it's too difficult to pick a system. My advice would be pick a system now, figure out what colors mean to you. You get 3 of them, right? And I'll show you briefly what colors mean to me on the LSAT and use them. Our brains are very visual and very color oriented. Dividing information, categorizing it is going to make it easier when you actually go back and have to reread any of the passage while answering questions. Easy tip number 1. Another thing I'm shocked people tend not to know, it has a control F. You can search the document for different words. Take advantage of that. That's a super, super important piece of the equation, right? Read with your cursor. Something that's helpful for me is a lot of the time, this plays into the 4th point here, but people tend to skim. Do not skip words. Your reading speed will increase with practice. It will increase with persistence. You'll learn to read faster by reading more, not skim. And it's so tempting to skim. I promise you, if you're skimming right now, that is the first bad habit to axe after this session. So reading with your cursor, do not skim. Do not skip words, especially while practicing. Doing that is going to save you time in the long run and save you a lot of understanding. So just kind of some final bigger thematic tips is be an active reader, engage with the text. Think about your life, think about how things connect. It's sort of a faux pas to bring in external information to the LSAT, but like many of you said, this is an exhausting process. Taking the test drains you. So connect the dots for yourself, make it interesting to you. That is a hugely important step of engaging critically with the text. The second and third are pretty similar too, right? Be a skeptic, challenge what you read, take everything with a grain of salt. Starting today, you're training to be a lawyer. And that means, you have to be a little bit annoying and absolutely methodical. So if something doesn't add up, take note, highlight it, mark it down. And then of course, the purpose of the reading comprehension passage to begin with, always examining what is the point? Why did I read this? What am I supposed to take away from this? Pretend there are no questions. You're just trying to learn. These are all the steps that are going to help you critically engage with reading comprehension. So we're going to do some practice. So now is a good time. Anyone has any quick questions about what we went over before we examine how to actually treat the text? I'll give you all 30 seconds. Looks like we don't have anything, so we'll just keep chugging. So we're going to do this passage together, but I want you all to be thinking out loud. And also, I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you all to consider how much time it takes me to read it out loud. To note is that during the actual exam, you cannot speak out loud. It's a really hard habit to eliminate from people who are used to mumbling or muttering. So consider what that means for you, what you need to practice in order to not do that while doing the actual practice itself. But for the group instruction's sake, I will be reading out loud. So this passage was adapted from an article published in 2000. So remember, context is super important. There's a reason they tell you these things. Why? Well, we're about to read a science passage, and science changes rapidly, especially because you can tell in the first line, we're reading about computers. Competition to make computer chips smaller and, consequently, faster and more efficient has driven a technological revolution, fueled economic growth, and rapidly made successive generations of computers obsolete. So, right off the bat, right, we get this strong start. In the chat, is this objective or persuasive? I'll take one or two answers. Feel free to drop it in. Okay, so we're about 50-50. And it's kind of because you're both right. You know, this is somewhere in the middle. So I guess it was a bit of a trick question. But we get some objective information, right? Competition to make computer chips smaller and consequently faster and more efficient has driven all of these things, right? Those are just facts. But also they paint this very positive perception of competition, right? So I'd say this is objective with quite a hint of persuasiveness, right? It doesn't say, you know, computer chips have doomed us all by getting smaller and our life is being swallowed by AI or whatever, you know, plagued our thoughts in 2000, right? So good eye, everybody. So let's keep going. Yet, at the current rate of progress, this march toward miniaturization, ooh, big word, right, would hit a wall by about 2010. For many, an unthinkable prospect. The laws of physics dictate that, with current methods, properly functioning transistors, all right, kind of a buzzword. I think, you know, some of us might know what that means, some of us might not, but then we get a definition. The electronic devices that make up computer chips cannot be made smaller than 25 nanometers, billionths of a meter. So right there, we kind of get like our initial premise. We get a bit of setup, right? I'm looking at this and I'm still thinking like, has a key concept been introduced? Kind of sounds like it, right? This concept of miniaturization hitting a wall by 2010 seems pretty important. We're going to want to keep track of that. Next, in living cells, however, natural chemical processes efficiently and precisely produce extremely complex structures below this size limit. Okay, that makes sense, right? In a cell, we got things happening that are more complicated than simple transistors. So there may be hope of using some such processes to yield tiny molecules that can either function like transistors or be induced to combine with other materials in carefully controlled ways to construct whole nanocircuits. Once again, we're building this key concept here, right? We have this wall of miniaturization that we're about to hit, and now we're figuring out, oh, living cells actually have already passed that wall. We just can't use them for computers yet. Much current research is aimed at harnessing DNA to this end, but materials chemist Angela Belker and physicist Evelyn Hu are investigating a different molecular pattern maker, peptides. Whoa. You know, it's been probably a decade since I've taken a chemistry course or a biology course. So seeing words like this, I'm going, okay, not really quite sure what's going on. But then we get another definition, right? Amino acid chains that are shorter than proteins. So we kind of walked through this, right? We looked at different components. And I want to show you all what highlighting might look like. So always looking at breaking it down by my structure. So yellow, I'm looking at facts, right? I'm looking at things that are important to building out some sort of key concept or something that doesn't really come with a full point, but it's still going to be important information and relevant later on. You know, has driven a technological revolution. These things are also super important, right? This is where we got towards, you know, persuasive end of things. So I'm going to highlight it a different color. Yet, at the current rate of progress, this march towards miniaturization, Boom, that stood out to me, right? Highlight yellow. Hit a wall by about 2010. Numbers, dates, times, highlight. So what we got here is just a rough sketch, right? Highlighting doesn't need to be perfect, but you need to be popping those things that are part of the word search, right? So yellow for me facts, purple is going to be things like tonal shifts or things to me that seem like some sort of, burgeoning key concept, something that could be that like greater nugget later on. And then last but not least, I use blue for what I think is going to be like the key concept or the main point, which is these physicists are investigating a different molecular pattern maker to make these transistors. So right now we got an interesting article, right? And the way I stay engaged is I go, things have changed a lot since 2000, and yet we still don't have this type of technology. So it's cool that we can read something in the past tense about something that still might be to come. To me, that's interesting. So let's go through some confusing and unknown words. Miniaturization is pretty simple, right? But what does that actually mean? Does it mean to miniaturize something? Does it mean some sort of bigger process? In the law, we call it a term of art when something has a very specific and discrete meaning. Same with nanocircuits, same with peptides. Well, a really quick and dirty trick is use inferential reasoning. Understand the purpose of the word. You don't need to get super hung up on any precise meaning. And a little trick I do with my students, just cross out the word. See what happens and how your brain's going to process it when you don't have that actual, term of art dictating or slowing you down in your reading. Use the words around it, use the meaning of the sentence. Think of general things that you could plug in place of that specific confusing word. Because, for instance, miniaturization here, pretty, maybe like a 5 out of 10 vocab word. You're going to get some 10 out of 10 vocab words. I've been teaching this for 2 years and I still run into words I don't know. It's part of the game, and it's how they keep you on your toes. They want you to use that inferential reasoning, right? It's part of reading comprehension. So at the current rate of progress, this march toward blank, toward progress is used up here, so that's kind of a good word. March toward smallness, something that we can pull from the upper text. We'll hit a wall by 2010. Down here, carefully controlled ways to construct whole nanocircuits. If you don't know that Latin stem nano, well, that's okay, because we can look to tiny molecules like transistors, billionths of a meter. We get these hints, right? And then finally, peptides. We know it's just going to be smaller than the size of transistors. So in the chat, just in like 1 or 2 sentences, take a second to predict what comes next in the next 2 paragraphs. Key concepts, characters, main point. We'll take about 30 seconds. Yeah, so main point would be like, what do you think the point is that they're going to try and make here? Do you think they're going to try and persuade you of something? And if so, what is that? Right. So what comes next now is we do get some more character and we do get to that main point. Cute and solution to the minimization problem using biology. Ajaya, if I'm saying your name correctly, you hit the nail on the head, so great job. That is the actual substance of what's coming. So Hugh says that in order to use such a method to assemble a set of circuit building tools, it would be necessary to identify many additional organic compounds that bind to circuit component materials. The group is making progress on that quest. As they have expanded their targets to 20 more semiconductor materials, their cache of crystal manipulating peptides has ballooned into the hundreds. They are also designing new peptides that bind to 2 different crystals at once, acting as a dab of glue. They'll take that kind of finesse at the nanoscale to produce self-assembling circuits. So what we have here, right, isn't exactly what Ajay said. It's an explanation of how biology is going to function like a transistor. This is the key concept. It's the main point, right? We have read all of this premise up here in order to really understand what's going on down here. This is the nuts and bolts. This is the actual science of what's happening. So that is one way to critically engage with the text that you're reading. Always predicting, always guessing, always looking for those word searches and anticipating what comes next. Once again, the most important thing you can do right now if you're struggling on this or just like can't seem to break a head wall is you need to go word by word. You need to take time to understand these key concepts. You know, if it feels like you're getting hung up on assembling a set of circuit building tools, you know, that it would be necessary to identify many additional organic compounds, take a step back. You know, if you are doing this as untimed practice for yourself, go look it up. These are the types of things that are going to build your knowledge over time. This is what it means to get reps, to understand the materials that we're reading. And it'll get you better at guessing and inferring what these processes are and how they work. So for the question, and one of the most typical questions that you'll see on the entire LSAT, which one of the following most accurately expresses the main point of the passage? Main point is a pretty simple question, and it's how you always want to be anticipating. The first question that comes next, it's like, why are we reading this, right? Why are we engaged? Why do we play the word search? Well, the answer is C, for those who have been reading ahead. Belker and Hughes' research on the abilities of some peptides to bind to semiconductor materials indicates that peptides might eventually be applied to the production of computer chips with transistors smaller than the lower limits set by current methods, which is, once again, why I got to give huge props to Ajaya for kind of guessing that ahead of time, right? That is the big end goal, is to be knowing the answer to these questions and why you're critically engaging to begin with. You kind of can't get to this answer unless you're thinking this way the entire time. So if you're curious about learning more about how to answer reading comprehension questions, or really just have, you know, some general questions about the LSAT, tune in next time. These happen about once a month on my end, or of course, always feel free to book a private session for one-on-one instruction. Thank you all so much for joining. If you want to work together, we have, you know, a free 15-minute intro call, and this is now also a good time for a Q&A. I see we went a little bit over, so we'll give 2 minutes for questions and answers. When's a good time to get a tutor? That's a great question. I would recommend getting a tutor or a coach. You know, if you've been studying for about a month and your score is plateauing, it's probably a good idea. Really, to get a tutor is one of the better financial investments you can make for yourself going into law school. Getting a high LSAT score is the #1 indicator of getting a scholarship. So if you're feeling stuck, if you're not at your goal, that is the time. Would you say the main point is typically located at the end of the passage? That's a great question, Gloria. The answer is no. Typically, the main point is going to be structured throughout the passage. And the main point needs to include the information included throughout the entire passage. So you can think of it almost like a pyramid, where the main point is sitting at the top and you need the foundation of everything built throughout the passage in order to reach that main point. What other methods do you recommend to increase reading speed? I recommend, you know, a lot of people are like, read The Economist, read the New York Times, read opinions. Do that for sure. I also would say read anything. Read fiction if that appeals to you the most. You know, if you're someone who needs like captions on TV, that's a great way to spend your time. The real issue I find is that people have short reading focus times. So the more you can read, that actually requires like sitting down for like 5 to 10 minutes, reading something one at a time. That's going to help you maintain that, you know, lack of fatigue, focus, all of those things that also increase your reading speed. I'm testing a 20+ for reading comp, but can I get a perfect score with more practice? Yes, Jamie, you can. So once you're, you know, 20+, that kind of puts you in the 163 to 168 range, depending on what you're doing for logical reasoning. And the answer is that is a good time if you're plateauing there to go get a tutor, whether it's me or someone else, because they're going to be able to pinpoint for you what's not clicking at that stage. A 20 plus shows me that you do have strong reading comprehension, and that the next step is hammering out any remaining or lingering weaknesses. Of course, Gloria, you're welcome. If I have extra time to double check my answers, do you suggest reading through the whole passage again to double check the answer? Great question, Beatrice. I don't think, unless you have extended time, it's going to be super feasible. I would instead pay attention to parts of the passage you might not have had full comprehension of the first time. And if you felt like that was kind of sticky, that's a good place to restart to really make sure you're locked into your understanding. Tips on how to stay consistent when studying for the LSAT: don't overdo it. If you are, overworked in your job, if you're like physically not feeling good, the worst thing that you can do is set yourself a study schedule that's unachievable. And those type of bad habits follow through law school. It's important to meet yourself where you're at. And then also, of course, be mindful of like when you want to take the test. And I'll always be asking, do I really have to take it, in August when there's no early admission for my dream school? Or alternatively, can I wait a year? What is needed, right? So set reasonable expectations for yourself. It's kind of like weightlifting, 30 minutes is not as good as an hour, but it's a hell of a lot better than 0. So I'll do one more. Okay, great question. Do you have any advice for people who speak English as a second language and are fluent, but still struggle with understanding complex vocabulary and deeper meanings? Yeah, so English as a second language is, this is probably one of the most difficult fields to practice English as a second language. It barely makes sense sometimes when English is your first language. And my advice would be kind of what I said a while back, right? If you get hung up on some key concepts, like, for instance, computer chip transistors, you could take a master's degree in a language course and just never get to that type of like business fluency. Take the time to take a step back, read some articles on, big picture concepts that are going to come up. Computers, basic ethics philosophy, basic legalese. Setting yourself up for success now and kind of priming for those things is one way to get ahead of it. So we are at time, folks. Really appreciate you all for coming out. And once again, if you would like to work together, feel free to schedule that free 15-minute call or book a one-on-one session. I really appreciate the engagement. And yeah, please go to the next session at 6. It's a really incredible panel. So thank you all. Take care.